Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Claire Delmar, and on behalf of Listen to Locals, I want to thank you and welcome you to the Southwest London GLA candidates debate, focusing on community participation. I'd like to thank the candidates for being so cooperative, actually even quite enthusiastic about this event, and also a big thank you to Julian Warwicker from the BBC, who is joining us as moderator. So thank you, Julian, and thank you, candidates. We have a program based on 6 topics and 6 community groups from across the constituency. We'll be presenting statements on those with questions to the candidates. This program is posted in the group chat. Speaking of which, you can ask questions throughout, and depending on time at the end, we will attempt to raise those questions from the attendees with the candidates. And finally, we have over 70 attendees today, and the session is being recorded, and it will be uploaded onto the Listen to Locals website and to YouTube afterwards. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Julian Warwicker. Over to you.
Claire, thank you very much, and hello to everybody, and welcome to those I can see on the screen and to those who are tuning in from wherever. As Claire said, we're concentrating on issues uppermost in the minds of people living in Southwest London prior to polling, of course, on the 6th of May. And I suspect most of you know this already, but the London Southwest seat on the Greater London Assembly covers an area comprising the boroughs of Hounslow, Richmond and Kingston. And since its creation in the year 2000, it has always been won by the Conservatives. Now, this inevitably a Zoom event. A little bit of an idea of the format to add to what Claire was saying a moment ago, because we have 90 minutes. In a moment, I'll introduce you to 4 of the candidates for that Southwest London Assembly seat, and they will then briefly introduce themselves to you. Then we're going to hear the concerns of particular groups with issues and or causes that they wish to highlight to their would-be political representatives. Each group will put their case in turn and raise questions, and then the candidates will have a chance to respond, and then we will move on to the next topic. We do have quite a lot of ground to cover, and everyone speaking, that's candidates and spokespeople for the various groups. I know you've been advised about time limitations. I say that now at the outset so that if or when I need to interrupt people because they're going over time, then you know they're doing that from an informed position. So I'm effectively covering my back before I do that. I don't imagine for one moment, though, that I'm going to have to call upon my inner Jackie Weaver. This is all going to be very civilized and good-humored, I'm sure, even when there are clear disagreements, which I'm sure there will be. On that subject, I recall the words of a former controller of Radio 4 who I worked for, who said to me once that he didn't much like phone-in programs, but he could tolerate them if they shed light rather than heat. And that's my aim, and no doubt yours as well, for the next little while. We know we have 3 of the 4 candidates already with us, and I think hoping for the 4th to arrive any second. I'm just looking in the chat room to see if that's happening, and it looks as if it might be. But let me go to the 3 that we have. First of all, they are Candice Atherton for Labour, Andre Fries for the Greens, and Nick Rogers for the Conservatives. We're hoping, as I say, to be joined in a moment by Gareth Roberts for the Liberal Democrats. Each has roughly 3 minutes to introduce themselves to you. And I thought it was as fair as it could be to enable that to happen in alphabetical order, which means, and you'll be aware that alphabetical order, Candice, tends to favour you in life, I suspect. So, Candice Atherton, your chance first to introduce yourself to those tuning in.
Thank you very much. Well, it's really, really great to be here. This is actually our first Hustings with other candidates. We've been involved in various other meetings where we have had quite a grilling already, but not with other candidates there. So yeah, this is going to be hopefully a really useful evening for everybody, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable. So yeah, my name's Candice Atherton. I am a councillor in the London Borough of Hounslow. I live in Feltham, which is in the west of the borough, and I'm a councillor for Hanworth, which is where I lived for 14 years. I've actually just moved to Feltham very, very recently. Yeah, it's really, really great to be here. and Listen to Locals is the name of this event. So I think the clue is in the title. I really hope by the end of this meeting that you do feel that I have listened to you and provided opportunities for you to sort of really raise issues that are important to you. And I hope that you feel at the end of this event that you will be able to consider putting your trust in me and considering me to be your GLA representative, which is what I really, really hope I can achieve at the end of this campaign. The reason that I was sort of quite assured when I looked at the outline for this event, I looked at the questions and I looked at the questioners, was that it made me sort of feel like, oh, I really am already listening. So throughout this campaign, I've been hearing from a number of the groups that are represented today. I know some of the people. I've had the opportunity to have other Zoom meetings already to talk about some of these issues. So that really reassured me that I already am reaching out and people are reaching out to me and sharing their concerns, and that I have been listening and I am responsive to those things. That's definitely my style of leadership. I am a leader who listens. I'm a leader who is a huge team player. So my style of leadership is very much about listening and responding, really understanding the issues by listening, by getting to know people who are impacted by the issues, and then trying to come up with the solutions also by including people who are very much affected by those issues. So that is completely my leadership style. My job currently professionally is an advocate. So again, in my role as an advocate, I am a listener. It's my job to really raise the voice, particularly raise the voice of some of the most marginalised people. I work with children in prison. So yeah, my job is all about advocating, speaking on behalf, or really trying to help children to amplify their own voices. If they can't amplify their own voices, I can advocate and speak for them as well. So I think that is a quality that I would bring if I was your GLA representative. The themes for this evening are all around housing, development, well-being and the environment, and they're all areas that I'm hugely passionate about. I lead on adult social care and health at the council. I've also been really very much involved in the corona pandemic and recovery response, which has really looked really holistically. So it's looking, how do we have a green recovery? How do we have a recovery that includes all our equalities groups? And that's another area that I'm really passionate about. So when we look at all of these things, when we're looking at housing, when we're looking at development and the environment, I really want to make sure that the front of my, my lens is really thinking about all the different groups who are impacted. I had my phone here to set a timer. I might be coming up to my 3 minutes, but really,
we're nearly there.
Thank you. Yeah, really, just ending to say that, yeah, I hope that you do feel that I listened to you this evening, and that I really do want to include all of you in the solutions that we need to find when it comes to these important issues moving forward.
Candice, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to a welcome. I can now see Gareth Roberts, so thank you for joining us. I know there were a few technical issues. I'm going to go to Andre Fries now for your 3-minute introduction. So Andre, over to you.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you everyone for inviting me here this evening. It's lovely to see as many faces as I can on my Zoom screen. Nice to see the candidates who I haven't, most of whom I haven't met before. Obviously, I know Gareth Roberts well because we are both we're fellow councillors over at Richmond. He's the leader of the council there, where I'm the deputy leader for the Green Group on the Richmond Council. So as I said, thank you. A little bit about me, give you a bit of background. I've lived in Ham, Richmond for most of the last 20 years. Although I have lived on and off in southwest London since my parents moved to Twickenham when I was a teenager, so I know the area well. My sons have grown up here and live in local schools. I was a governor of the primary school, and I'm now very involved in community groups in my area, including I'm a member of the Ham and Petersham Neighbourhood Forum, which focuses on planning, and we've developed our own local plan. I've also helped set up and run Ham Parade Market for the past 3 years to help create a more community feel in the area and to try and bring a bit of a buzz back to our local high street. And I also volunteer with Ham and Petersham SOS, which is an organisation that takes the elderly and the less mobile on shopping trips on a weekly basis. I do that once or twice a month when I can. And I've just done it again last week after not having been able to do it for so many months, and it's just been a joy to see my old friends again and take them out, and for them to get out as well. Such a pleasure. As I said, I've been elected councillor since 2018. Many of the achievements, and we've done this cross-party because the Greens like to work with other people, is we've declared a climate emergency in the borough. Richmond is now an accredited living wage payer, and we've also recently called on the government to carry out a basic income trial. So those are the things that some of the achievements the Greens have helped make on Richmond Council. But why do I want to become an Assembly member? Well, actually, for the last 18 months, my day job has been working at City Hall, supporting Sian Berry and Caroline Russell, who are the two Green Assembly members in City Hall. So I exactly know the work they do and how effective they can be and how much pressure they can bring to bear on the mayor and what actually they can get done. So some of their achievements have been, for example, Sian Berry won 70 million in youth services from the current mayor because she had a long running campaign highlighting how youth services have been cut across the borough. She got a ballot for residents on estates facing demolition, again winning that from the current mayor. She's also forced the current mayor to oppose Heathrow expansion on climate grounds, while he still backs having a bigger Gatwick expansion. And at the same time, they also got the mayor and the London Assembly to declare a climate emergency, and again bring forward targets to 2030 rather than the 2050 originally planned. If I was elected to the GLA, things I would like to build on are Sian and Caroline, particularly Sian's really strong work on housing. Her campaign, she has been campaigning for a long time to bring residents' voices into City Hall where they've been facing demolition. We need to call immediately for a suspension of right to buy. We need to stop the loss of council homes. And while for renters, we must stop Section 21 evictions. These are not necessarily things that the London Assembly can do, but we can certainly push the mayor and push the government to work harder on those. And we also need to bring in rent controls and a London living rent. On transport, we need to invest in healthy streets, walking, cycling, better buses and new public transport links. One of Sian Berry's key manifesto policies would be to create a single zone for tube and rail like they have in other cities around the world and like we have for buses, which would make it much cheaper for people in outer London to actually travel around. We would also bring in a smart fare road pricing system to replace the congestion charge and the ULEZ, and that way we would help pay for some of the problems that we have on our roads, because at the moment everyone's fares actually pay for the upkeep of our roads. So finally, we would make London the greenest city in the world. We need to set really strong targets to solve the climate and ecological emergency by 2030. We've got to protect our green spaces, stop using pesticides. We must make all transport in London carbon zero and non-polluting by 2030. And we need to invest in green energy, retrofitting homes to end fuel poverty and create skilled new jobs. So that's why I'd be asking for you to vote for me, the Green Party and Sian Berry on the 6th of May. Thank you.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. Let me go now to Gareth Roberts for the Liberal Democrats. Gareth.
Thanks, Julian, and thank you everybody for inviting me along this evening. As you know, my name is Gareth Roberts and I'm the leader of the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames. I've been a local councillor for the last 11 years and leader of the council since 2018. And when we were elected, it was based on a platform of making Richmond Borough a fairer, cleaner, safer and greener borough. And we've achieved much of that. One of the first things that we did, for example, in terms of financial fairness, was to scrap the Tory policy of forcing those who are on the 100% benefits to pay council tax at all. And now the 100% council tax relief has been reinstated. And of course, we've done other things, as Andre has alluded to. It's awfully kind, Andre, to take some of the heavy lifting off our shoulders to claim that the accredited living wage was a green achievement, but of course it was brought by a Liberal Democratic administration. We've also brought in 20 mile an hour to our roads, making them safer both for motorists, but also for pedestrians and cyclists. And we have been working very closely cross-party, both within the borough and at City Hall level, to make the case for more police on our local streets. Because as we move into a post-pandemic world, where we are going to be spending far more time in our local areas, we need to make sure that people have got the confidence to stay within their local areas, and that means making sure that there's not only feet on the street, but also a physical police presence. So that means reversing the closures of some of our police stations, which we've seen over recent years. I would like to be a strong, experienced voice for you at City Hall, somebody who would not only be able to give them a challenge when required, but also work cooperatively with the mayor as a member of the little-known group, which is called London Councils. I've seen for myself at first hand that it is possible for London boroughs to all work together to achieve common goals. And I think that that's something which can still be achieved at City Hall. Over the last 8 to 12 years, unfortunately, the centre ground at City Hall has been largely eroded. And we now have two monolithic blocks of the Labour group and the Conservative group, where the Greens and the Liberal Democrats are largely squeezed into the centre just across 3 seats. Whereas before, we had a far greater platform. And I would like to restore that, because when there was more voices at City Hall, more things got done. So in the very early years, the Olympics were successfully bid for, the congestion charge in central London came in, and of course the hire scheme for bicycles was brought in, the so-called Boris bikes, Santander bikes, Ken bikes, whatever you like to call them. That was brought in under a London Assembly which had a rich number of voices speaking out and working cross-party to make things happen. Over the last 8 years to 12 years, with the monoliths that we've seen established of the two main parties, we've had stagnation. Very little has happened which has been of any benefit. Boris's Garden Bridge, for example, is a prime example of how little has been done at City Hall. So we need to have more Liberal Democrats. I hope you will support us in the forthcoming election. And I'm here to listen this evening and hopefully to answer your questions. What I will say is that some of the answers I give, you might not like, because I believe that it's important for politicians to be as honest as they possibly can, particularly on issues which are going to be of importance to you on a day-to-day basis. We have to be realistic in politics. I could offer you the moon on a stick this evening, but that wouldn't be fair, that wouldn't be honest, and that wouldn't be true to either myself or to you. So I hope that you will support me on May the 6th, or indeed earlier when you get your postal votes in the next couple of days. And I look forward to the discussion this evening.
Thank you very much indeed. Finally, to you, Nick Rogers for the Conservatives.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Listen to Locals for organising tonight. We're going to be touching on some very, very interesting issues indeed. So I'm Nick Rogers. I'm the Conservative candidate for South West London. I live in Kingston with my husband, and I strongly believe that politicians should have relevant, real-world experience to help them be effective representatives. And that's exactly what I want to bring to the role if I'm elected to the Assembly. So I've worked in public transport for over a decade, starting out at Transport for London, over the last 10 years at Network Rail. So I know how crucial it is that new development is supported by decent public transport. I've been a Metropolitan Police Special Constable, so I understand the importance of building safe and welcoming neighbourhoods. I've set up and run successful community projects. So I've experienced exactly the same sorts of frustrations and issues and problems that many sort of representatives of the groups on this call would probably recognise. I think groups like those involved on this call are the bedrock of civic life in London. You are all here and you all do what you do because you care about your local communities and you want them to be the best they can possibly be. So my aim is to be an open, accessible, visible and active Assembly member. And a key part of that is going to be supporting groups like yours. I think Assembly members have a unique platform. They're positioned at a level where they can lend support to local groups like you, and they can also exert influence on London-wide policy. And I want to use that platform as an Assembly member to be a champion for our communities here in South West London. Now, I'm the only candidate here who isn't a councillor, and I recognise that if I'm elected, I'll be a new voice in the South West London political scene. So I hope that that will enable me to bring a fresh perspective, new enthusiasm, and independent thinking to help tackle the problems that we face. So thank you once again for organising, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Nick, thank you very much. Thanks to all four for your opening observations and contributions. Well, we're going to go to the first topic, which has been chosen by the organisers, which is post-pandemic planning. And to highlight the issues raised under that heading, we're going to hear from John Ricketts of the Q Society. So, John, if you can unmute yourself and make your presentation, we're all waiting to hear from you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and thank you, candidates. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted many of the problems of high-density living in tall apartment blocks. During the lockdown, many have had to supervise homeschooling for their children, and have felt the need for more space where children can play safely. A permanent change in working patterns means a lot more people will be working from home. In this environment, it is very appropriate for residents to live in houses on streets with access to plenty of green space, rather than in cramped tower blocks where there are greater chances of virus will spread more easily. We should remember that the Chief Medical Officer has said that the virus is not going to go away. We must learn to live with it in future. In October 2020, the Mayor of London approved the application to redevelop the home-based site at Manor Road, North Sheen. This application had been refused by Richmond Council on the grounds that this mass of tall buildings, up to 11 stories, was outside the area zoned by the council for tall buildings and was totally inappropriate for the surrounding low-rise suburban environment. In a letter to the Mayor in December 2020, the Secretary of State stated, "I believe boroughs should be empowered to choose where tall buildings are built within their communities, and the new London plan states tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified as suitable in development plans." Many consider the home-based development as being overly dense and lacking in adequate green and public space for the number of people and families. It is sited in an area already over the limit. It is cited already in an area over the legal limit for air pollution, which the new development and the traffic it generated would only add to. The London plan emphasises the importance of healthy streets and amenity areas for children and adults. The Mayor's main reason for approving this application was that, as negotiated directly by the Mayor's team with the developer, it provided the optimum number of residential units. But this is at the expense of a post-COVID environment conducive to people's well-being. My question is, could candidates please outline how they would ensure that people's well-being in a post-COVID environment and the priorities set directly by local boroughs are not sacrificed in future planning decisions by the London Mayor? Thank you.
John, thank you very much. So could candidates please outline how they would ensure that people's well-being in a post-COVID environment and the priorities set directly by local boroughs are not sacrificed in future planning decisions by the London Mayor? Nick Rogers.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course, I think the pandemic has thrown into sharp relief problems that we've been talking about for a long time, but never before has there been such a dramatic illustration of the real world consequences of housing policy. I mean, we've known for a long time that high-rise towers are bad for physical and mental health. Studies have shown that high-rise residents, especially older people, report feeling isolated, lonely in these types of developments. They're also bad for the environment and they contribute to overcrowding. And the pandemic has just highlighted all of this. There was a study from Create Streets showing the difference in experience of people who lived in tower blocks and people who lived in terraced housing during the pandemic. 45% of people who lived in tower blocks reported no interactions with their neighbours at all. And that rose to 59% for people with no access to outdoor space. And to me, that's no way to build a healthy city. And the type and design of the housing we build plays a significant role in people's mental and physical health. I support Sean Bailey's policy to have a moratorium on building new tower blocks in outer London, and I think that that we need to draw a line not between new housing and well-being of existing and new residents. We need to draw a line that connects those things. We need to find the right kind of balance.
Can I just direct you specifically to what John said about sacrificing future planning decisions by the London Mayor, priorities set directly by local boroughs? How would you tackle that specifically?
I think it goes back to that platform that I want to have as an assembly member. I want to be a champion for these local communities and to challenge local authorities and to challenge the mayor to make sure that resident priorities are met. And I think you have to do that all throughout the process. You have to make sure that those local priorities are understood at the beginning of the planning process. And I know that in Kew, for example, you're going to be nervous about the acquisition of the Kew retail park from Berkeley Homes. We need to make sure that local needs, local priorities are understood at the very beginning by Berkeley Homes, by getting them in the room with with the local community.
Let me go to Gareth Roberts on this question. Post-COVID environment, the priorities set directly by local boroughs, which you will know only too well, and not sacrificing those in future planning decisions by the London Mayor. How do you tackle John's question specifically?
Well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because planning is set by central government. The legislation which surrounds it is set by central government. And it's only with a change in primary legislation that we can really make things happen. I mean, then we heard from John about Robert Jenrick's intervention with his desires for local people to have a final say on stuff. It was incredibly disappointing that he didn't put his money where his mouth was and call in the decision from the London Mayor, which he had the opportunity to do. And I understand that Sarah Olney MP is still lobbying him to reconsider that decision. What we do need to try to do, as I've said earlier, is to have honest discussions about housing. The idea that there is, that high-rise or mid-rise is anathema and cannot be considered, I think is for the birds. We have a growing population in the capital, and people do require housing. And unfortunately, particularly in areas such as Richmond, where there is very little in the way of available space, if you can't build outwards, on lateral, you need to go up to a certain extent. But it does need to bring the community with them from an early stage. I mean, one of the things which I always remember, I used to sit on the planning committee, was the amount of grief which came between neighbours because they hadn't spoken to each other properly at the very beginning of the planning application. So what needs to be happening on sites such as the one which Nick mentioned in Kew and on this site was the developers bringing their proposals to the local community first and foremost, and seeing what could be built, what could be sustained, what they would put up with.
But
and that's
going back to John's point, are you effectively suggesting that at GLA level, there is a very, very limited amount of power that you or whoever were to win this particular seat? There's a very limited amount of power that you have if the mayor is determined to do something you don't like.
Unfortunately, that is exactly the case. We can lobby, we can certainly lobby as much as we can and bring matters to his attention, but he has been told, both on Stag Brewery and on Mortlake, not Mortlake, on the Manor Circus development.
Don't go to Mortlake yet, because we'll be there.
We'll be going on to Stag, I'm sure. But on these particularly local things, the mayor has been told in no uncertainty by local residents what they don't want. Unfortunately, there has already been very little in the way of lobbying done by our incumbent assembly member who's been strangely silent.
Yeah. Okay.
But really, it's a case of electing somebody who can both work with and challenge the mayor.
Right. Let me bring Andre Fries in. Andre.
Thank you. Just unmuting myself there. Thank you. Yes, to a certain extent, I have to admit that Gareth is right. It is a tricky one. The way the London Assembly is set up, and I have first-hand experience of this, having worked with Sian and Caroline over the last year. I hope I won't say that too many times tonight, but I get casework, and I have had casework literally on most of the developments mentioned here tonight, that are all referenced here in the paperwork that we were sent beforehand. And it is a problem that what happens is all too often developers fly in their architect, they design something which they think is wonderful, and the community is left sitting there going, well, that's great for those new people who are going to live there, but that doesn't account for what our needs and the community's needs are. Sian Berry has done a lot of work on housing to try and bring residents' voices into the mayor and into the GLA more generally. But it is an uphill struggle. She has monthly meetings with Tom Copley, who's a deputy mayor for housing and regeneration. And she has been pushing him to bring in residents. I mean, a lot of what she's worked on is on estate demolition, which is slightly different to what this particular what's happening in Richmond in this specific case, and trying to bring their voices in and to say, these are the people who know the estate well. Why can't you work with them to look at the bits of land that are on the estate and make it work for them and do add-ons and improve the homes that are already there? And what Sian Berry would like to do, and what the Greens would like to do if we had more power in the GLA, is set up something called the People's Land Commission, whereby we would extend that idea and go around in boroughs and look at what's available in communities and look at the land that it's available there, and then talk to the communities and the groups like the ones that we've talked about this evening who know about that, and they can share with us their ideas, and it can be community-led rather than it being developer-led. And these things can be done, it just takes a different way of thinking.
Okay, sorry to rush you. Candice, your answer to what John Ricketts put forward.
Thank you, John, for your question. I think it's a really, really good question, and I do believe that the pandemic that has just happened and is still happening does provide a really, really good opportunity. And it definitely felt like sort of through the year last year that councils were being responsive, government was being to an extent responding to sort of some of the things that have been thrown up by the pandemic. So my hope is that we really will make sure that we recognise that well-being has to be something that is considered across all the different areas of government, areas of the GLA, and I do feel that this is something that the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, has listened to and does understand. I think he has a really good grasp of children's mental health and well-being and adults' mental health and well-being, and how that impacts individuals, communities, wider society. So I think that in all the decision making, well-being will now become something, especially for in lady leadership, that is considered. I know that in Sadiq's manifesto, he's looking to create City Hall developer, and I think this is something, I have to agree with Andre and Gareth that it's very difficult for local councils and it's difficult for the GLA and the London Mayor when it comes to planning, because the law is set nationally, so you're constantly having to sort of almost do a dance with developers. And
just on that briefly before we move on to the next topic, I mean, if Sadiq Khan remains as London Mayor and you were elected as a Labour representative for this area, how prepared would you be to speak out against what he did, even though you're both from the same party?
I mean, I see the role very much as, they say the critical friend. It's quite, similar to a councillor, similar to, I've sat on scrutiny panel before, and actually was in housing and environment scrutiny panel, and so it's very much about, as much as I really respect and agree with so much that is coming from City Hall, from Sadiq Khan, I would also be very happy to challenge. And I know that when we look at tall developments, actually when you look at footprints of developments, there are ways of getting similar amount of units when you look at the whole footprint. So I would want to push much harder on that, and I think that's what happens in at the moment. We can only do that through mitigation, and some councils have more success when it comes to mitigations about getting heights reduced than others. But yeah, I would definitely be willing to push that. But I think a solution that he has found is having, if City Hall is actually a developer, then they can be much more responsive to it. They can listen to the local community. They can be much more responsive because they're not having to meet the demands of developers whose interests are just about profit. A City Hall developer. You're going to stop me. Okay, that's absolutely fine. I'm sure I can bring some things into other questions.
There are themes there that I suspect we'll return to. John, thank you very much for your question. I'm going to move it on to our next topic, and this takes us to the community-led planning alternatives as our heading, and to guide us through that, Sally Pelham, you can see her on the screen, is there from the Mortlake Brewery Community Group. Sally, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Julian. For over 10 years now, members of the Mortlake Brewery Community Group have been volunteering their time, their energy and their expertise to create an integrated, sustainable and thriving community in Mortlake. This is a community that is pro-development and pro-social housing, but we firmly believe that any development of the former Stag Brewery site must be done in a way that's sensitive to its unique setting. Sensitive in terms of design, because this is where the urban Thames become green, and building heights need to be sensitive to the local listed buildings and conservation areas, and sensitive to the very real and inherent transport constraints of the site, which is bordered by the river on one side, the railway line on the other, and the only access is from a 5-way junction where the South Circular meets the A316. Listen to Locals offers the perfect platform for the issue now facing Mortlake. Since the GLA called in this planning application, a scheme which, according to Richmond Borough Council, was already pushing at the boundary of what is possible, has got bigger still. There's 40% more residential units, up to 3 extra stories in height, and still no credible traffic mitigation, despite the fact that that was one of the reasons it was called in. And all of this with no community involvement whatsoever, despite all of those years of professional volunteers and experts. And furthermore, the proposed scheme contravenes the recently adopted London plan, which explicitly gives to the local authority the right to determine both what is a tall building and to identify sites where tall developments may be appropriate. My question to the panel is twofold. First, what message does it send to community groups if 10 years of dedicated, voluntary, professional effort can get so shamelessly ignored? And second, what would you do if elected to bring the proposals for the Stag Brewery site back in line with the community's ambition, the inherent constraints of the site, and the 2021 London plan? Thank you.
Sally, thank you very much indeed for that. Gareth Roberts, I'm going to come to you first on this. What do you say to Sally?
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Sally. Yes, it is really disappointing that the Mayor has decided to lob these huge amounts of extra units into this site, going up from 813 to 1,250. Yes, there is more affordable housing as a result of that, but it only takes it from 17% to 30%. What we had achieved with the, working with the developer, both, and I have to say that this was under the Conservatives as well as the Liberal Democrats, before the change of administration, was what we felt a scheme which was sympathetic to the local area, was sympathetic to the heritage aspects of the site, and was proportionate in its size. But unfortunately, the Mayor has decided to ride roughshod over all of that. And it's just yet another example of the fact that the Mayor couldn't give a tuppence down about what happens in South West London. There are no votes for him to be lost here, so he can do what he likes, and he can take his inner London housing targets and force them onto areas which are unable to cope, to be honest, with overdevelopment of this size. What is a real issue, though, in terms of the community plans and the community, bringing them forward, is the fact that the community doesn't own the land. It's the developer that owns it, and they have a right, as the owners of the land, to bring forward their own plans, which they have. And we would like to see, as I was saying in the previous answer, greater communication right at the very beginning, right at the outset of these developments, so that the community can feed in. And I would be more than happy if I was elected to try to facilitate more of those discussions going on. I'm afraid the Stag Brewery, yes, of course.
The analysis that says there's been no community involvement whatsoever in the recent decision-making element of this particular plan.
Sorry, what was that, Julian? There was a bad line.
Sally was making the point, all of this with no community involvement whatsoever was one very telling line in her presentation. Do you accept that analysis?
Not entirely. I mean, we have had, I've had delegations come to York House from the groups to speak to me about the development. Unfortunately, some of the stuff seemed to be hung up on the issue of the school rather than the site, rather than the housing itself. And of course, we did listen to the people who came to the planning committee when it was discussed, and we rejected the expansion of the Chalkers Corner junction, because that would have brought that big road right very close to lots of people's houses, social housing. And we did listen to residents on those issues. But unfortunately, it's always very difficult to say, you can have anything you want in planning. If people own the land, it has to be their decision whether they want to take community feedback on board.
Andre Fries, a response from you to Sally's point.
Thank you. Yeah, so it is. I agree. A lot of the casework that we get as councillors and also as assembly members is often this endless point that communities are not listened to, and the developers, as I said before, just come in, put in their plans, and the community is left behind. We hear that from in Homebase and Tesco in Osterley, and then at Mortlake Brewery in Richmond, and also Kingston Town Centre and the Cambridge Road Estate over in Kingston. One of mayoral candidate Sean Berry's manifesto policies is to ensure more diversity in the housing market. She's constantly called for small builders, community groups, co-ops to be allowed to build on land, to be given allocation, to be allowed to bid for land, so that rather than having a site sold off to one large developer, it is broken up, so smaller developers and individual builders can buy it as well, so you get more opportunity for a diversity of land. So Green Mayor supports housing associations, small builders, cooperatives cooperatives. We would also open up the London Development Board to be more transparent and bring in new members from tenant, resident and community housing groups. And in those ways, you would bring in more people, bring in more community voices.
Does that answer the point raised by Sally? She said, what message does it send to community groups if 10 years of dedicated voluntary and professional effort can get so shamelessly ignored? Are you saying that some of the things that you have just aired would bring those groups back into the forefront of this?
Absolutely. Sean Barry,
the mayor doesn't take any notice is the wider point.
At the moment, the mayor is not interested in listening to community groups. We have tried. We try and arrange meetings. He is not interested. A Green mayor would listen and would open up the doors of City Hall to community groups.
Let me bring another voice. Candice Atherton.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely my response to this question. I mean, when I met with a representative from the Mortlake group, they I couldn't believe the detail that you have gone to, and the research that's been done, and the understanding. It was like hugely impressive. It was like being briefed by a team who get paid to do this stuff all the time, which is what I get briefings from public officers at the council. So I was really impressed, and they were also able to communicate in a way that it made so much sense that this was a development that clearly has got some big questions and some issues that need to be considered. I would just like to challenge what Gareth has said. Sort of, it feels a bit. I feel a bit concerned that in your first question, your response was very much like, "Oh, the mayor doesn't have that much control," but then here you're very happy to completely stick this to Sadiq.
Well, I think the point in the first question was that the mayor has the control and isn't necessarily listening to those on a more local level, and the same issue is in theory arising here, Candy. So how do you address that?
No, I think the response to the first question was very much that planning policy is set nationally, and so the mayor's hands are tied as much as local council leaders' hands are tied to an extent.
But here we have a situation where the mayor seems to be deciding and local people are not necessarily feeling as if they've had their say.
Well, I think it's currently still with the mayor. It has been called in, so a decision hasn't been made. If I am the representative, I would be very much wanting to have a meeting with Jules Pipe as soon as possible to discuss this and to raise the concerns that have been raised with me. I also heard that Gareth said that after a meeting, there was changes around Chalkers Corner, but my understanding was that was a meeting that did eventually happen at City Hall. I appreciate that lots more meetings have been happening with the developers, and again the community group feel like they're not being listened to as much as they'd want to. And again, that's something that I would really push. When you've got groups who have got this much expertise, who have spent this much time, 10 years, understanding this issue, then that there is a need to do more listening, and I'm more than willing to push that issue to raise it with the mayor.
Thank you. Nick Rogers, your response to the point that Sally raised.
Thank you very much, Sally. So the first point of your question, Sally, was what kind of message does this send? I think it sends an absolutely appalling message. I think it sends a disgraceful message. I think of all the things that happen in urban life, development and overdevelopment is the biggest thing that people feel is done to them rather than with them. And I think that creates a vicious circle. Excessive development is imposed on people. It leads them to become increasingly disengaged and disenchanted with overall democratic processes. And then that becomes into a sense of futility about even engaging in public life. And I think that's so sad. And it's something that I've experienced on the doorstep far too often. I think on the second point of what can be done, well, it doesn't solve the problem now, but what I would certainly be calling for as an Assembly member is a far greater adoption of neighbourhood planning as a way of at the very outset, defining what communities believe is acceptable in terms of development. And London is actually, London's falling behind the rest of England. I think in the rest of England, you've got 700 neighbourhood plans. In London, there are only 16. In southwest London, Richmond has one neighbourhood plan. I think Andre touched on it earlier in Ham. Kingston and Hounslow don't have any. Neighbourhood planning is a way of getting people on board early, having those discussions early, getting people in the room early. And I've seen as a councillor, when I was a councillor in Kent, how this can help. So there was a planning application in my ward. We got the developer in a room with a community group, and it resulted in the country's first developer-led free school. So these things can happen
just a brief observation, if you would, before I move on to the next topic. I mean, clearly there was a degree of finger pointing in Sadiq Khan's direction in the last two questions, but there is also surely a degree of finger pointing higher up than that. And if you came forward with a series of neighbourhood plans, why would Robert generally take any notice of those ultimately?
But the neighbourhood planning feeds into the local borough planning process.
Sure.
So it's a way of getting people on board with that process early.
It might end up on his desk, is the point I'm getting at.
Quite exactly. But then you have to use your platform, as I keep talking about, as an assembly member, exercise that influence, that soft power to campaign and lobby on behalf of your residents.
Thank you all candidates for your contributions on that one. Thank you, Sally, as well, for raising it. We'll have time at the end to go back over some of this, I'm hoping. Next, we're looking at responding to crises and unforeseen events. And that brings me to Carolyn Boys of Hammersmith Bridge SOS. The title of your group, Carolyn, says it all. So what do you want to say to the four candidates?
Thank you very much. Well, as you know, along 2 years ago, Hammersmith Bridge closed without warning. And since then, it closed to cars, buses, emergency vehicles, massively affecting the lives of thousands of residents in South West London and beyond. And 7 months ago, the bridge completely closed to pedestrians without warning. That evening, I saw people frantically trying to get home, climb the barriers and being turned back by guards. Since then, thousands of us have had our lives disrupted because there's been a failure of everyone to prepare for the worst, despite the obvious vulnerabilities of the bridge. So, for example, TfL was warned repeatedly not to run so many buses across the bridge and had put no contingency plan in place. There should have been a plan for a temporary bridge in the event that Hammersmith Bridge had to be closed long-term for repairs. Now, a journey which previously took 5 minutes can take more than an hour. So there has been a failure of cooperation and political willpower to find a solution for this really vital piece of London infrastructure. The only agreed plan in place right now is a proposed temporary ferry, which has lower capacity than the bridge. It was promised this would be operational this spring, but it now looks likely that it will be the autumn. So road traffic has been pushed into adjoining boroughs with a lot of effects on pollution. And those residential developments we were talking about are still planned, despite the obvious effects on both traffic and pollution. Given there is no agreed plan in place for pedestrians, let alone vehicles, to cross the bridge, what do? This is all because of failures of foresight by everybody involved to have a robust plan for London's infrastructure. Many locals have commented that this lack of planning is more worthy of a third world country than one of the major global hubs, and a capital which supplies a quarter of the UK's GDP. So my question to you all is, if you are elected, what specifically do you propose to do to accelerate a solution for Hammersmith Bridge? And adjoining that, we've talked about residential development plans. Are you going to ensure that there are no further residential development plans to ensure no further bottlenecks in traffic for people forced into cars and buses by their inability to cross the bridge?
Let me put that specific first question to all of my four panelists. Thank you, Carolyn, for that. Candice Atherton, if you were elected, what would you do about Hammersmith Bridge?
I would definitely be calling on the government to accept greater responsibility here. I think it's just not acceptable that they're asking for Hammersmith and Fulham to fund 50% of this project. It's when councils have been squeezed for the last 10 years, and we've had a reduction in budget of 60%, and we don't have this amount of money in reserves to be able to pay. And as much as it is important to be have preparedness, and what the pandemic has taught us is how important it is to be prepared. If councils are expected to foot the bill when really big projects such as this fail or go wrong, or there's a disaster, then council budgets need to reflect that. So I would want to be getting everybody in the room, asking the mayor, or depending on if it was appropriate for me myself, but making sure that the right people are in the right room. And you're right, it cannot be about politics. It's really important that everyone recognises that this impacts so many Londoners. It impacts a number of boroughs. It impacts Hounslow, where I'm a councillor. It impacts Richmond, an area I'm hoping to represent at the GLA. So, you know, it has massive environmental implications. It's huge. So it cannot just be expected that one council would solve this this problem. There has to be a response, a collective response.
Okay. Nick Rogers, what would you do about Hammersmith Bridge?
Thank you. So this is, I believe that the mayor has a critical role to play in ensuring the continuity of key city infrastructure, such as Hammersmith Bridge, even if it's not under his direct control. So I would support Sean Bailey's three-point plan. First, to build a temporary road bridge that would take traffic, that would take pedestrian, cyclist, buses, everything, and pay that out of TfL's cash reserves, that the money is there, the options are there. It just needs a mayor who will choose to use that for the benefit of the residents of Barnes and the rest of South West London. The second is to keep crossings free of charge. The ferry service will be up and running soon, and Sean is pledging to make sure that that's not a tolled service. The same with any temporary bridges or even the full bridge when it's finished. And finally, the London Infrastructure Bank, which is one of Sean's flagship transport policies, would be a way of funding the full repairs to the bridge in the long term, and that brings together public money, private money, to create a fund that will pay for big infrastructure projects across London for, I think, brings in about 11 billion over the course of 3 years. But more broadly on this sort of thing, I too am kind of shocked that there wasn't a contingency plan for losing a critical piece of infrastructure like this. My whole job, my last 10 years of railway experience, has basically been dealing with things when they go wrong. And you have contingency plans for absolutely everything. I've been involved with implementing and reviewing contingency plans at Waterloo Station and on the railway network across South West London and beyond. And one of the things I really think we should do, both in the context of the pandemic and wider, looking at things like Hammersmith Bridge, is to review London's emergency planning process to make sure it's not just a sort of intellectual exercise, and that you do that plan, do, review thing that you have to do with emergency plans.
Nick, thank you. Andre Fries, what would you do about Hammersmith Bridge?
Well, it's interesting here, the Conservatives and Labour talking about and each blaming the other, one blaming the mayor and one blaming the government. And that's been, as I'm sure Carolyn knows, a long-standing ploy by both the major parties over the last few years. It's always the mayor's fault. No, it's the Conservatives' fault. And we've had far too many candidates coming down to Hammersmith Bridge and having their picture taken and their video taken, going, oh yes, when I'm mayor, or when I'm the MP, or I will get this fixed. And actually none of them have done anything at the end of the day, and it has been used as a shocking political football, which is an absolute disgrace. And the poor residents of Barnes and Hammersmith should be seeing red over it.
And you would do what?
Colour. But what would I do? Initially, we would get the bridge open as soon as possible. We would set a target date to get it open to walking and cycling as soon as reasonably possible, and so people have certainty. They need to know when that's going to happen, and that needs to happen as soon as possible. With regards to the future funding of it, the Department of Transport funds huge infrastructure projects across the country. It has to fund this one. There is no way that any council or TfL, which is funded 80% by fares, so basically we're asking Londoners fare transport users to pay for the fixing of a rail bridge. Absolutely not. Oh, sorry, of a traffic bridge. Absolutely not. This is something that the government has to pay for and needs to get on with it and pull their finger out, frankly.
That's clear. Gareth Roberts, what would you do about Hammersmith Bridge?
Julian, and thank you, Carolyn, for the question. I mean, I am slightly delighted once again to find ourselves heading into an election and find a Conservative politician saying that if they are elected, that they will make sure that a temporary road bridge is built. We saw that in December of 2019 with that Goldsmith, and I'm afraid it didn't end well for him. What we need to have, I mean, getting away from the idea of Hammersmith bridges, what really needs to happen is that all of the bridges are taken out of the hands of local government. because we simply don't have the budgets to maintain them and to fix them when things go drastically wrong. We need a 21st century equivalent of the City of London Bridges Trust, the City Bridges Trust, which maintains those bridges very well. And it is properly funded. It's a huge amount of cash behind it, but that's what is needed. The idea that the government have been able to sit on their hands for the last 18 months and effectively bicker with Hammersmith Council about whether they're prepared to put this much in, that much in, so much here, so much there, is really quite ludicrous. If they'd bitten the bullet in, let me see, it would have been about September or October of last year, and put the money up for the first, the stage 1 and 2 stabilisation works for the bridge, we'd have people across that bridge on cycle and foot within the next couple of months, because that was the timescales. But Charlotte Veer, the minister, refused to do that. And she said, I mean, it's not a bad point she was making, that if you put the money up for the stage 1 and 2 stabilisation, she would have just bought herself a very, very expensive walking and cycling bridge. So there is an impetus to make sure that there is some form of transport going back over it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing your longer term plan, and believe me, I'm not dismissing it by interrupting. But in terms of where we go in the nearer future, what would be your answer to that specifically, given what Carolyn put forward?
Well, I want to see the temporary bridge, which is now being, because I'm on the task force for the Hammersmith Bridge. There is the temporary bridge. We're going to get the ferry. It's not as good as it should have been. I agree with you, Carolyn. 400 an hour each way in peak. It could have been far more, but we've not had a peep, by the way, from Sadiq Khan. We've not had a peep from Tony Arbour, our London Assembly member, apart from asking a straight question City Hall wants. And what we need to do is to get behind the scheme which is coming forward to build the temporary structure in between and get that pushed through, and for the government to come forward with the money. They can argue about what's happening in terms of how they get it back at a later date. Just give us, to use Bob Geldof's view, just give us the money and we'll do the job.
Okay, yeah, I'm reading one or two messages suggesting it should be a government funded. They didn't necessarily use Bob Geldof's language. No. They're going down the same road. Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn, for that. I'm going to move it on, and this takes us to developers' access to City Hall. So we're striking similar themes. Helen Hinton is with us of the Kingston Independent Residents Group. So Helen, over to you, make your case.
Thank you very much, Julian. Yes, the new London plan, is it a plan for developers, not Londoners? The new London plan has just been published condemning southwest London, particularly Hounslow and Kingston, to massive development and population increases. With huge housing targets, Kingston itself has to build 964 homes each year. Like Candice, the Labour candidate, said, there is a dance to be done with developers. Developers have been handed massive powers in order to achieve these targets, getting favourable access to council planning departments, desperate to achieve these targets, and bargaining to avoid the affordable homes quota. Developers can use viability assessments to reduce affordable housing requirements, where they can show that this would prevent a project from going ahead. Councils, and ultimately the mayor, appear to nod through damaging developments, which are contrary to the local plan and their own residents' opposition, and in some cases, other borrowers oppose it. This largely unfettered development is causing damage to vulnerable and internationally protected habitats in Richmond Park and Wimbledon Common, our heritage and communities. With development threatening industrial land, the green belt and metropolitan open land in very special circumstances, which may be that there is no other suitable land available, are we removing employment possibilities, leisure facilities like golf courses, and farmland in order to satisfy targets which will not meet affordable homes quotas, but will provide attractive profits for property developers? Are we building homes for rich overseas investors, which will lie empty while the homeless camp out on the pavements outside? So to the candidates, I'm asking, do you believe that these new targets are achievable, will deliver enough affordable units? And if so, how will the homes be delivered without destroying South West London? Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much. Do you believe these targets are achievable, will deliver enough affordable units, and if so, how the homes will be delivered without destroying southwest London? Andre Fries.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by saying that, I mean, firstly, housing targets have been set by this government are based on increase in population figures. They're not based on need. There's been no assessment of need. It's pure, oh, look, more people are living here, more people have been coming in, more people are born, let's build more housing. But actually, those targets have just recently been reassessed by the Office of National Statistics because of the Brexit and because of the pandemic. So as a result, we massively need to revise those housing targets. Secondly, we don't have a housing crisis in this country. We have an affordability crisis. That is the main problem. We don't need block after tower block of tiny flats with no inside light. That is the last thing that we need. And part of the reason that we have this affordability crisis is because we have the sell-off of the right to buy and council demolitions. Sian Berry has done excellent work over the last few years, highlighting the net loss of council homes particularly since Boris Johnson came into being mayor. Sadiq Khan is turning the corner on that. I will give him credit for that. He is doing it, however, it is happening very, very slowly. We need to have an immediate call on for suspension of end of right to buy. We need to stop council state demolitions. We have a ridiculous, I mean, you sell off a council home and that council home then goes into, a few years later, goes into a market price. That is then sold off many times often to a buy-to-let landlord who then rents it back, oh, guess what, to the council on social, and so the taxpayer is paying again. The bill is huge. The amount of money, something like £700 million is spent by councils across London each year on temporary housing because we don't have enough council homes.
Can I just take you back to Helen's question? Do you believe these targets are achievable? My understanding of what you're saying
of course not.
is that you need to rewrite the targets.
Yeah, these targets are not achievable. No, and we need to rewrite the targets. We need to relook at how we do housing. Right. There is plenty of brownfield land that reports have been done. There's enough brownfield land across London. There's enough existing building that can be changed to make the houses that we need.
Let me bring other voices in. Gareth Roberts, do you believe these targets are achievable, and what are the consequences in southwest London that Helen alluded to?
No, I agree to a certain extent with what Andre was saying. They're not achievable, the targets. The mayor's idea was that these, effectively stuck a zero on our target houses in Richmond, give or take. And his idea was, well, it can largely be achieved on small sites, and we simply don't have the small sites in Richmond. That's why you are now finding things like Stag Brewery and the Manor Circus, and of course the Q site coming into play, and there will have to be lots of housing there simply because the mayor says so. It's a tricky one in terms of, because I want to get back to the bits which Helen was saying about this idea that developers are getting preferential treatment. Yeah. Frankly, I want developers to be able to talk as much as possible to the local authority planners and of course the local community groups, because it's by talking to the planners that they will get an idea of what's acceptable in the local area. What we don't want to be in the position is non-determination applications being granted. We don't want to be in the position where a developer will bring forward a large-scale development and it'll get turned down at planning, but they just go then straight to Bristol and get it forced through. And we don't want the situation where the mayor will come along and then just decide to stick an extra 3 stories on it. So I have got no problem at all with developers having access to town hall planners, for want of a less pompous term. They need to have that access because it's only by talking with developers, with local communities and with residents that we'll get the development that we need for our local areas, not what gets forced on us by other parties.
Candice Atherton, your response to what Helen put forward.
Thank you. Can you just reiterate the question again, just to make sure I answer it?
Sure. She asked at the end of her presentation, do you believe these targets outlined in the London plan with regards to housing are achievable, will deliver enough affordable units, and if so, how the homes will be delivered without destroying southwest London?
Thank you, thanks. Yeah, I was listening and getting sort of my mind was going elsewhere, listening to the responses. I do agree with Andre. I mean, I'd really welcome a review because you know, I've sort of listened to those numbers and the targets and understood that that is based on the needs. So you know, I would definitely support a review of what, you know, what is the actual need. I know as in our local council, we're very aware of what our own need is within the borough. We know who is on the housing waiting list. We know who's in, you know, insufficient housing. And so lots of the time, as I mentioned about this dance, we know that we do need housing, and mostly it's for housing for people that already live in the borough. But then because we have to do this dance with the developers, they're not always providing the housing that is needing. It won't necessarily meet that need. As a Labour Council, we really do push for affordable and real affordable, and we tend to reject planning applications that have anything less than 35%, which is why I was quite surprised that initially the Stag, the Bury development was accepted on 17% in Richmond. That's something that Hounslow wouldn't do, but still, it's, you know, it does then lead to the, you know, when you're pushing affordable housing, real affordable housing, then the developers will talk about viability, and then you can end up with bigger sites and bigger, more units.
Up on bigger sites, because I suspect in Helen's mind, when it comes to this notion of destroying Southwest London, is the scale of some of these developments.
Yeah, scale. Yeah, I agree, and I'm also interested. I know in Hounslow we are now looking at our small sites, and we're having quite a lot of success. We're doing really well. We're in the you know, in the top 10. I think we might be even in the top 3 of London boroughs who are actually building council houses. So real affordable social rent houses for our community. And we are looking at smaller sites now, and we're having some success with that. Okay. So yeah, I think definitely I would be very interested to know about the review, because it's really important that we really understand what the need is and what the demand is for housing. But I also agree that the main thing is about affordability and the fact that, you know, we have got enough housing. But that's why I really welcome what Sadiq's doing around. He really wants to push for rent controls. He needs more devolved powers in order to do that, and I would support that. So it's really about making sure that people have secure, you know, renting could be absolutely a suitable way of living if it's secure, and if, you know, if the tenancies are secure, and if it is affordable. But we've got into this awful situation where private rent is so expensive and so unaffordable, and also it's very insecure, hence why people tend to want to have home ownership. But, yeah.
Moving on. Nick Rogers, your answer to the question that was posed by Helen.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, Helen will be all too aware of the situations in Kingston. We've had it seems like a rash of tower blocks going up recently, and we also had some close calls. There was a proposal on Canbury Place that would have been, if it was actually built in the initial proposal, the tallest building between central London and New York City. And I know that because the current tallest building between central London and New York City is in Basingstoke, where my office is. So we've been taller than that, been a massive building. Unfortunately, thanks to community action and an engagement with developers, it didn't happen. And I think it's important that we, as well as, you know, we need new housing. Definitely, we do need new housing, but it has to be the right sort, and it has to be in the right sort of places. We need affordable, family-sized homes, and lots of developments we see in Southwest London are not that. I'm looking at Barbara, who is going to be facing the Tesco and home-based development in Osterley, which is full of flats. There's a tiny percentage of actual family-sized housing, and everything we've been discussing tonight, touching on the need for, you know, outside space and how housing design affects people's mental and physical health. All that builds into this.
You're just on targets. I mean, there's clearly been doubts expressed by some of your fellow candidates as to whether this current figure is a sensible one, or we might need to look at it again. Where are you on that?
I think it's always important to challenge targets to push back if the community feels that they're not right, and to make sure that that we are aiming for things that are deliverable. There's no point, for example, having a target that simply cannot be achieved. You don't gain anything through striving for that.
Can this one be achieved, do you think, in its current form?
Well, again, that's something that that needs to be challenged and looked at. That needs community engagement to sort of decide on that.
Okay, Helen, thank you for the question. And let's move it on. We've got 2 more topics to try and squeeze in, and then hopefully some final remarks. We did start a little late, so we're not doing too badly on the clock as it stands. Let me bring in Rich Clark, because the issue we're looking at for the next few moments is the degreening of London's neighbourhoods, and Richard Clark is from Green Feltham. Richard, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm a local organiser and a member of a number of community groups. I'm not representing any one today. This is more as a kind of local activist view, partly to protect those other groups who I am involved with. Over the past year, many people have grown to love their green spaces. They found them a sanctuary and a place of connection with nature, of seeing people, even if they couldn't actually speak to them, and for children more recently being able to use the playgrounds. In Feltham, we have seen an explosion of litter picking groups as people have discovered the treasures on their doorsteps and want to cherish them. And although there have been issues around litter, actually people are looking after those spaces and taking action. And this is replicated across South West London with many community-led action groups, including in Heston and Cranford, the action groups there, Berrylands Nature Reserve, Duke's Meadows, Nella Gardens, Feltham Pond, and more. However, many green spaces are under threat from development. A large part of the Feltham Marshalling Yards open space were lost to a new train depot, and as yet there's no secure public access to the remainder of the site, even though that was promised. The Hounslow local plan, which is yet to be formally inspected, proposes building on 125 acres of green belt, the size of 200 football pitches, covering a vast swathe of land around Bedfont and the southern edge of Heathrow, and around Hounslow Urban Farm. And just this week, a planning proposal has been submitted for a 14-storey building on the site of a former allotment by Feltham Station adjacent to the Longford River, the so-called New Road Triangle, a process that has been less than transparent and would overshadow the 1-storey show people site next door, and appears to take advantage of the council's role as landover, spatial developer and developer, spatial planner and developer. However, the Greenbelt Review in Hounslow lacked real community participation, seemed more driven by plans for Heathrow expansion. Councils have announced climate emergencies, but are their policies really backing this up? And is the Mayor providing sufficient scrutiny of these proposals? And is his London plan strong enough to enable green spaces to be protected? Elsewhere, land under MOL and OOLTI is under threat, and once lost, this land is seldom replaced. As candidate for South West London, what is your view about development on green space and its protection and enhancement? And how would you ensure the Mayor undertakes proper scrutiny of developments and protection for these vital green lungs? And what evidence do you have that you're a green space champion?
Yeah, Richard, thank you very much indeed. If I can ask all 4 of you to focus solely on what Richard posed and keep your answers reasonably concise, because I want to make sure we get plenty of time for our last contribution as well. Candice Atherton, a green space champion, how can you convince Richard Clark that you are that champion?
Yeah, I would like to think that I am a green space champion. Over this campaign, I've had the opportunity, only in a small way, because we've, at the beginning I was being very well behaved and staying at home. But as I've been able to sort of get out and about a bit more, I've been going across the southwest, and had the opportunity to go to Norbiton in Kingston, and I met a wonderful family who live on one of the estates there, and they've just got access to an allotment. And we were just able to have a really lovely conversation. I was on one side of the fence that was separating between the park and the allotments. We had this lovely conversation with this family who, you know, living in high rise, but they've just got this allotment. They were there with their 2 children. They'd just set a fire. They were going to spend like the rest of the afternoon there. The children were excited about having marshmallows. And it was just really a good example, just, you know, a reminder of how important green space is. And, you know, it doesn't have to be your very own green space that you own. You know, it doesn't have to be a garden to bring well-being and enjoyment and leisure to people's lives. So, you know, I would love to champion opportunities for more allotments. I also know a local resident who does loads of work around giving back to the community. And one thing, he managed to get some funding from the Mayor of London over the pandemic because he recognised that people in high rises didn't have access to green spaces, and so he does these amazing giveaways where he's giving like plants to people, and you know, they literally might have a window box and that's what they can nurture and grow, but it can teach children, it can be something that they can look at as they look out of the window, or you know, a plant that's in their indoors, and it connects them with nature. And I've been asked, well, I think it was when I was having a meeting with a group around the green COVID recovery, and they were sort of saying, how do we get people to care about the environment? And I think it's getting people from a young age to experience nature, and whether that's in your local park, or whether it's, you know, being able to grow plants on your, you know, on your balcony, whether it's being able to have an allotment, whether it's I really think that that's really important. But also going into co-design and planning, I think we have to be listening to our community. I do recognise that it is a tension. We need housing, we need to do building, and that does sometimes mean that we have to make really difficult decisions. I would only build on metropolitan open land at an absolute, you know, a last resort, but you know, I do think that has to be considered. But it sounds like you want me to wrap up.
I'm not because I'm not listening, but because I wanted to bring others in, and we've got one more to cover. Gareth Roberts, Green Champion, how do you convince Richard Clarke that that is you?
Oh, just before I go into that, I mean, the people of Heathfield will raise a massive eyebrow at the idea that Candice and Labour Hounslow are Green Champions, given the fact that they sold one of the very few bits of metropolitan open land in Heathfield, which they owned, and that's now going to be built on. So it's, you know, they will take that with a pinch of salt. Richmond upon Thames, one of the greenest boroughs in the capital, if not the country, and we have a proud tradition of maintaining not just our open spaces, but maintaining access to open spaces. And of course, we've got the Royal Parks within the borough, and we have been working closely with the Royal Parks to ensure that the recent road traffic closures, which they've brought in, have been managed responsibly, so that we can bring back these parks as being areas for you know, the scientific interests and nature reserves, rather than just being a cut through for cars. So yes, we do take the responsibility that we have very seriously in Richmond upon Thames. We're a beautiful green space, and we would try as much as possible, I would try as much as possible, if elected for South West London, to ensure that we were bringing that best practice across all of the 3 boroughs.
Okay, Nick Rogers, Green Champion, can you convince Richard Clarke that that is you?
Thank you. Well, I think the thing that bugs me the most about building on Greenbelt, metropolitan open land, other protected designations, is that you don't need to do it. There's plenty of other more suitable land available to build on in London, whether brownfield sites, whether TfL-owned land, whether you know, underused strategic industrial land, whatever it might be. So there's, you know, the Green Belt is one of the most successful post-war policies that there is. It was brought in to protect the character of suburbs from overdevelopment, and it does just that. And we must defend the Green Belt. But Richard's talking about enhancing as well as protecting. And I think that's an absolutely critical aspect of this. And Sean Bailey, I would highly recommend you look at his manifesto, which came out today, and it includes some very interesting policies on this topic. For example, incorporating biodiversity measures into new developments, amending the London plan to put beauty and high quality design at the heart of development. So as an Assembly member, I would support local communities in challenging development that threatens our green spaces. And I've been doing that as a candidate. I've been campaigning on planning issues across Southwest London. But also I think it's important that where developers and house builders get it right, that we showcase that. And in order to make sure that happens more often, we need to communicate and engage early and often. And I know, Richard, in your area, there's the Hamworth Park House proposals coming forward. And that is the kind of thing which, if it's done properly, it could be a way of protecting the environment, green space and heritage, whilst also providing housing that we need. So that's something, for example, I'll be looking very, very carefully at if elected, and that's something I would really like to get involved with.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. I came to you, Andre, last on this because I was waiting to hear everybody else say how green they were before you say how green you are.
Thank you very much. There's three things I want to touch on. One is the issue. I mean, I know that in the Tesco home-based site in Osterley, the build that they're designing there is not going to have any green spaces on the ground. They're putting all their green spaces on top. That is not any way to expect people to live. How the development sites need to be built better so that the green spaces are available on a ground level for everyone to use. Secondly, a small thing that the Green Party champions, a thing called parklets, so that, for example, if you don't own a car, that doesn't mean you still can't access the space outside, potentially outside your home or on the street near you, and actually turn a car parking space into a space for an allotment, for a little garden, for a seating area. So bringing green onto the street level and taking that space away from cars, who are metal chunks giving out a lot of pollution. And the third one is, Rich may remember, we did actually meet last year when I came down to Hounslow Urban Farm with Caroline Russell, because she was launching her report called Gold Plate the Green Belt, which is all about the threats to the green belt and the overdevelopment and the worry that we have that it's not being utilised in the best way possible. And all too often developers see it as nice land it's easy to develop on because it's cheaper than brownfield, and they can put on nice 5-bedroom luxury homes there. So what the Gold Plate the Green Belt has a lot of really good points in there about what to do to protect it. Things like creating green corridors, green bridges over motorways and roads to allow animals and create corridors throughout our city. We would also reforest a lot of the green belt as well. Only 16% of London's green belt is covered by woodland, so we would help reforest that. We would also promote farming on there to ensure that we have local food to support London in situations like a pandemic, like when we have Brexit and you can't necessarily bring the food in from overseas. We would have more local food, and that would create more jobs and skills. So yeah, the Green Party, it's in our name, I have to say it, sorry.
Well, I thought there might be
the champions.
Yes, thank you very much. Richard, I'll leave you to decide who is your green champion in the light of what you've just heard. And go to our last contributor, because our final focus is on transparency and trust in the planning system. And Barbara had a name check a moment ago, Barbara Stryak from the Osterley and White Green Residents Association. I made sure I checked the name when I saw Algra on my list a few days ago. Barbara, over to you. You're still muted at the moment, Barbara. That's it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Right, so the residents of Osterley, Isleworth and Brentford have just experienced probably one of the worst planning committee meetings ever in Hounslow. Planning applications were approved to build 2,150 homes on the Tesco and home-based sites at Gillette Corner on the A4 in 16 tower blocks across the two sites, with heights up to 17 stories, only 25 houses, and only 18% of the total units would have 3 or more bedrooms. We are not NIMBYs and would welcome developments appropriate for the area. Surrounding local homes are mainly 2 to 3 stories. Our red line is 6 stories. Developers say it would be unviable to go below 17 stories. The council received over 800 objections and less than 30 letters of support. Yet the developer tried to tell the planning committee that the objections were a minority view and that the results of their online survey suggested support, but their dubious surveys were never made available for analysis. The residents' evidence-based objections were swept aside. What swung the decision was the need to meet the Mayor of London's housing targets, irrespective of quality, and the 30 million SIL contribution, whereas we need 500 million for the 2 rail connections to improve the current poor PTAL rating of 2. Improved public transport is vital for the additional 6,000 residents, and we had been asking to be involved in discussions with TfL since autumn 2019, but this never happened. The virtual planning meeting on the 8th of April was bizarre. The objectors had to speak before the developments had been introduced to the meeting, which is not the format we had been told about 2 days before the meeting. We need a revolution in the planning system, one that treats the local community as equal partners to the developer. The judgment of planning officers should be professional and independent, whether or not it coincides with the council's aims. The current opaque system encourages behind-the-scenes deals, and this in turn encourages councillors to respond to strategically important planning applications on political rather than planning grounds. So my question to the candidates is, how would you drastically overhaul the failed planning process in Hounslow to build some level of trust and transparency into the system?
Barbara, thank you very much. Kenny, so I'll come to you last on this one because that seems logical. Let me go to the non-councillor first. Nick Rogers, you heard Barbara's appeal. I don't know whether you accept her analysis of the failed planning process as she puts it, but if you do, how would you drastically overhaul it if you won?
So, I mean, as Barbara knows, I've been talking to OGRA for a while about this application. If you live in the area, you may recognise my leaflet that I put out, and I helped supported the organisation by putting together a campaign to raise awareness of this. And I look forward to supporting whatever OGRA wants to do next, whether they intend to appeal the decision. I think so much of this goes back to the kinds of engagement that we've been talking about all through this evening. I've talked earlier about neighbourhood planning. That would, if they'd done that at the outset, if Hounslow Council had engaged in that process more fully, or even at all with the residents there, it would have the development would have been understood up front. Residents would have been able to show what their limitations were, what they were willing to accept, and the developer could have met them part way. But yes, the residents have to be put at the heart of the planning process, and that again is around neighbourhood planning through transparency about developer access at all levels of the process, and through early and frequent engagement. And I think Barbara touched on the issue around consultations and around involvement in the planning process. We have to be aware that some people are excluded from digital consultation. We have to make awareness of those people as well. But also, I want planning authorities such as Hounslow to think laterally about consultations and to go where the residents are, rather than just expecting residents to come to them. And I'm thinking about things like community Facebook groups, which may include tens of thousands of residents and will be an ideal place for local authorities to go for consultations.
Nick, thank you very much. Gareth Roberts, the suggestion was that we have a failed planning process, not just in Hounslow, but elsewhere, no doubt as well in Barbara's mind. If she's right, what would you do about it?
Well, again, this brings me back to the points I was making in the very first question, is that these are very much matters which are decided at national level in terms of what planning policy is. And if a developer has a piece of land and wishes to come with a proposal to develop it, and it is within the local planning framework, it is allowable within the local planning framework, then they can apply for the planning permission. It is up to the local authority, certainly, to start having early conversations with local residents about what they would like to see should a site become available. However, once an application is brought to the local authority, they have to determine this in a very sort of Olympian high level, with neither fear nor favour. Everybody, whether it's the residents who are objecting or the developers who are proposing, have to be given equal weighting. And I took Barbara's point about there being, was it 800 objections to this scheme? Of course, it's fine to have 800.
Over 800, she said, yeah.
Over 800.
Yeah.
It's fine to have large numbers of objections, but they have to be grounded in planning policy. And I'm sorry, that is a real cop-out of an answer. But if you have 800 objections which are not sustainable as a planning, in planning law, then you will find it going off to Bristol and the decision is taken out of everybody's hands. I agree with Nick, actually, regarding the point which we both made this evening, regarding the discussions at a very, very early stage with developers, bring everybody in. Okay. But unfortunately, and I appreciate that I'm now in the market for the world's smallest violin, but I will back to the planning departments and local authorities. They have a very tough time of it, and they do, by and large, get things right, particularly the councillors who sit on the planning committee of any party. But they do have to keep one eye on the fact that they aren't just doing a popularity contest. They are interpreting what can be very taxing and often abstruse planning legislation.
Okay, Gareth, thank you. Andre Fries, how do you deal with Barbara's concerns?
It is a very difficult one. As a councillor, I do sit on the planning committee, and I don't know what the situation is in Kingston and Hounslow because I don't sit on their committees, but I know that in Richmond we try incredibly hard to make it as a non-political process as possible. We try very hard to listen to all the different voices, and on occasion I have no doubt we get it wrong, and on occasion we have situations where literally the planning law tells us what we have to do, whether we like it or not. There are many things that I would not pass because from green perspective, they don't meet climate emergency targets or those any of sort of environmental aspects. But the planning, within the planning guidelines, there is nothing there that I can actually say this law, this planning aspect says we should refuse it because it will cause harm in this area.
So when Barbara says we have a failed planning process that needs drastically overhauling, I'm sensing from you that it's not as bad as that.
I don't think it's that the planning process necessarily needs a overhauling. I think, as we've talked a lot about this evening, the whole of the planning system is in chaos. We have national levels, we have regional levels and local levels, and not all, and many of them are not actually functioning together terribly well.
Let me go to, sorry, Andre, I didn't mean to.
I was just going to say one last quick thing on the London plan, for example. We need much more community involvement in that. Things like citizens' assemblies or actual proper consultation led by different by intermediaries to mediate for people would be a much better way forward. And that is part of Green Party policy, is to try and change things through people-led community involvement.
Candice, how would you drastically overhaul the failed planning process in Hounslow to build some level of trust and transparency into the system? That was Barbara's question.
So I definitely agree that communication really early on is really important. I have some understanding of this issue, and I've met with Olga, and I also have met a number of times with the councillors who represent the area, who also were very outspoken and very supportive of Barbara and her people in her group, and really were sort of quite pushing against this development. And so I think communication at the very, and I know one point of the stage there was part of the process where the community were being told, well, you're too late with some things. So I think that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be that you're preparing things and then you're told, oh, actually, you haven't got that to the council in time, or this date has passed, etc. So it's really making sure that there's communication that is clear from the very beginning about how these processes work. But I agree with what Gareth and Andre have said. It's very difficult. My first experience of this was when people in Hanworth came to me about a planning issue, and everything that they said I completely agreed with. There was concerns about noise pollution. There was concern about bats and biodiversity being destroyed. There was all of these issues that to me felt like it stood a really strong case that this was an application that wouldn't be able to go through. But then that, I learned sort of the hard way when I sort of stood there and made all these demands at the planning meeting, that actually all their objections didn't break any sort of planning policy, so they weren't able to be upheld. And the planning application went ahead. So I can see the frustration with this particular site. I do feel concerned. I went and joined. Oh, hang on, I've got to plug my laptop in. Maybe I'll be all right, but I don't want it to cut off.
Okay.
I went and saw the amazing 3D model that they've built to just show the scale you know, and it doesn't look, you know, my hope was that there'd be more mitigations. I was surprised that there hasn't been more mitigations, but ultimately, you know, if developers design something in line with the law that is set by national government, which allows developers to do everything they can to maximize profits, and that's the part that we have to challenge, then it's very difficult. I know something that we can do, which is what something Hounslow has done, is we have currently changed our own planning policy, local planning policy, but that sadly did not come into effect in time for this particular development. But I do believe that things going forward, that will mean that some things are slightly better for future developments that come to planning, especially if there's objections by the community.
I'll leave you to sort out your technicals for a moment. Thank you, Barbara, for your question. And thank you to all of you for the work you've done in putting this together. We've just got a few moments left. And I just wanted to take advantage of that by going to each of you in turn. You've obviously heard the concerns that have been put forward. And perhaps for each of you to identify an issue or a point of view which has really resonated with you from each of our contributors, and to say specifically, if you win, what you will do about it. And I'm going to do that in reverse order to where we began, which means, Nick Rogers, I'll come to you first on that. Something you've heard tonight that you would vow to act upon if you win.
Thank you, Julian. Well, I mean, thank you to everyone else for, as you say, putting this together. It's been a really interesting event, lots of interesting discussions. Thanks to the other candidates as well. I think we've had some overlap, actually, of agreement. I heard the immortal words, I agree with Nick. I haven't heard that since 2010, I think. I think it was.
Nothing if not old school, Nick.
But to get to the heart of the question, I think the main thing I've been hearing is that people feel left out of this process. They feel that they're not being listened to, and that existing processes are not taking full account of resident views. So if there's one thing that I would promise, it would be that I would use that platform, that unique platform that Assembly members have, that pitch between the local and the regional and the national, to lobby for transparency and openness, to campaign on behalf of residents, and to use that platform to make our communities better than ever, and to make sure that residents' voices are heard in these issues.
Nick, thank you. Andre Fries, a brief answer to what you've heard tonight that you would act upon if you won.
To be honest, it is similar to Nick, and I think it is that sense of people feeling unheard, and we've been hearing that a lot of times over the last few years, particularly around development. And I mean, Caroline Russell and Sean Berry have done some really good stuff, bringing in sort of the unheard voices of people like bus drivers, the gig economy workers, into City Hall, fighting for workers' rights and for micro businesses and those kind of things. And I think we've got to the point, and Sean has done a lot to bring the voices of people who live on council estates where they're being demolished. And she literally won from Sadiq Khan the right for those people to have ballots on demolitions. So it's, again, I think there's a wider issue now of bringing in the voices of communities like we've heard from tonight, who are facing overdevelopment, and get them in and get them having meetings with the mayor and the deputy mayors, whoever they are. And as Assembly member, that is something I would absolutely pledge to do, is to make sure those people are brought in. I will bring them in and make sure they have those meetings.
Okay, Candice Atherton, one thing you've heard tonight, one thing you'd act upon if you won.
So what I've heard is that well-being is hugely important, and that everyone tonight, as much as they recognise that there is a need for development, but it needs to be done sustainably, there's also a huge important part of that needs to recognise how developments impact the wider community, how they impact the people who are going to be living in the houses, but also the people who are living in the houses and the flats around the new development. So definitely I want to take away that any decision making, even when it's on the most obscure of panels, or where you'd think that well-being wouldn't be a factor, it's really making sure that well-being is considered, and at the very beginning of decision making. And also, yeah, I really liked what Andre was saying around reviewing, and so that's something that I will definitely take back. I'll take it back to our local council, that we really sure on what our demand is and where that information is coming from. And again, I would also want to be asking those kind of questions of what the real demand is, what the real, and then looking at target space and what the real need is.
Thank you. Gareth Roberts, finally to you on what you've heard and what you'll act upon if you win.
Thank you. It has been largely an issue regarding communication, whether it's people being heard or whether they're hearing from their elected representatives. The one thing which I do know is that for the last 21 years, we've had the same person who has been the South West London Assembly member. And have you heard from him on Mortlake Brewery? Have you heard from him on Osterley? Have you heard from him on Stag? Have you heard from him on Hammersmith Bridge? That needs to change. If somebody is an elected representative, they have to stand up for the people who represent them and also communicate that two-way communication. So the thing I would change is that you would hear from your South West London Assembly representative. I would be open and transparent in my communications, and I would make sure that I come to hear from you on a regular basis. We need to change the way that politics works in London. And if we can get people who really want to make the London Assembly work, which it hasn't been doing for the last 8 to 12 years, then we need to start electing those people who are going to put in the hard yards and do the graft. So that is what I would be offering. It's the communication. You have to listen, but you also have to talk.
Okay. Thank you to all four of you, Candice, Andre, Nick, and Gareth. I talked about needing to summon my inner Jackie Weaver at the start of this, and there was never a hint of that at any point, which shows how good-humoured it was, even if there were disagreements along the way. And thank you to everybody who's been listening in and watching in, and I know some various messages have come in as well. And I'm going to throw back to Claire as a final farewell from me. So Claire, back to you.
I just want to thank everybody, the candidates, Andre, Nick, Gareth, and Candice. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been illuminating, to say the least, and it's nice to be the catalyst for you all meeting each other for the first time. So well done, and thank you. Special thanks to our community group leaders, John, Sally, Carolyn, Helen, Rich, and Barbara. We've got a real cross spread across the constituency, and as well as the topics that are clearly of importance to people. I think we all now know how important it is for our elected officials to listen to locals. This is not the last you're going to see of us. So thank you for kickstarting something that I think is going to be a very powerful and accelerating movement. Look forward to working with you on that. And last but not least, I want to give a very special thanks to our fabulous moderator, Julian Warwicker from the BBC. There's a reason why BBC presenters are so calm and so able to handle conflict, etc.
Not always, but we try.
So thank you very much. And I noticed that Sean Bailey from the My London has been doing a live tweet. So if anybody wants to revisit what they said, you can either look at her Twitter feed, come to the Listen to Locals website, or go to the YouTube channel, which we will have this uploaded to afterwards. So thanks again. Very much enjoyed it, and onward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.